Few ever discover the depth hidden within the simple invitation to abide. Many hear the words, repeat them, admire their beauty, yet continue to live as though life was something to be managed from the outside. They strive, they struggle, they plan and push, believing that effort alone produces results. But abiding is not an action of the mind, nor a discipline of the will. It is a quiet surrender into an already existing union. To abide is to remain consciously aware that life is not separate from its source. It is the recognition that the same intelligence animating the universe is breathing itself as you. When this is not understood, people seek fulfillment through accumulation, recognition, and endless activity. Yet none of these bring lasting peace, because peace is not found by adding something to life, but by resting in the life that already is. The difficulty is not that abiding is complex, but that it requires the laying down of personal control. The human tendency is to take responsibility for outcomes, to believe that everything depends upon personal strength or cleverness. Abiding invites the opposite movement. It asks that one release the burden of authorship and allow life to express itself through receptive awareness. When one abides inwardly, there is a noticeable shift. Decisions are no longer forced, direction arises naturally. What needs to be said is spoken without rehearsal. What needs to be done presents itself without anxiety. This does not lead to passivity but to inspired action. Activity continues but the strain is gone. Effort gives way to flow. Few ever discover this because the mind prefers visible proof. It wants techniques, formulas, and guarantees. Abiding offers none of these. It offers trust. It offers a silent knowing that does not argue or explain itself. This silent knowing becomes the root from which all true fruit appears. Fruitfulness is never produced by strain. No branch struggles to bear fruit. It remains connected and life does the rest. In the same way, when one remains inwardly aligned, expression happens without force. Right relationships appear. Supply arrives in forms appropriate to the moment. Healing unfolds as resistance dissolves. Abiding does not mean withdrawing from the world. It means no longer being driven by it. One may still engage fully with responsibilities, work and relationships, yet inwardly remain untouched by fear or urgency. There is a calm center that does not react, because it is anchored in something deeper than circumstance. As this awareness deepens, the sense of a personal Dora fades. Life is no longer happening to you, nor because of you but through you. This realization brings humility, not weakness. Gratitude replaces pride, wonder replaces control. One begins to see that the smallest moments are infused with meaning when lived from union rather than separation. Few discover this because it cannot be achieved. It can only be accepted. The moment one stops trying to become something and rests in what already is, abiding reveals itself. And from that quiet place, life speaks, acts, heals, and fulfills itself without resistance. Abiding is often misunderstood because the human mind immediately translates it into something to be done, practiced, or achieved. Effort feels familiar and effort feels safe because it gives the sense of control. Yet abiding has nothing to do with striving toward a higher state or maintaining a mental posture through discipline. It is not an act of will, concentration, or repetition of thoughts. Abiding is the recognition of an existing oneness that has never been broken, never weakened, and never dependent on personal ability. Effort assumes separation. Whenever there is effort, there is an individual trying to reach something outside of himself. Conscious union reveals that there has never been an outside. Life is not distant, waiting to be invited or persuaded. It is already present, already functioning, already expressing itself. The moment effort enters, attention shifts from awareness to achievement, from presence to performance. Abiding begins when this movement stops. Conscious union is a quiet awareness that life is not something we possess but something we participate in. It is the gentle realization that the same intelligence moving the stars is animating thought, breath, and action. This awareness does not require constant remembrance through mental repetition. It reveals itself naturally when resistance drops. Silence becomes more meaningful than words, and stillness becomes more productive than strain. When effort is released, there is often fear, because effort has been mistaken for responsibility. People believe that without pushing, nothing will happen. Yet in conscious union, action continues without pressure. Decisions arise without mental debate. Right movement replaces frantic motion. What once required struggle now unfolds with ease, not because circumstances are different, but because the sense of separation has dissolved. Abiding is not holding on to a spiritual feeling or maintaining a peaceful mood. Feelings rise and fall, but union remains unchanged. Conscious union is not emotional comfort, it is clarity. It does not fluctuate with external events. In this awareness, success and failure lose their power to define identity, because identity is no longer rooted in outcomes. Effort exhausts because it places the burden of life on a personal self that was never meant to carry it. Conscious union restores life to its proper source. One begins to notice that creativity flows without forcing ideas, that compassion appears without moral pressure, that understanding comes without analysis. These are not accomplishments but expressions. Few recognize this because the mind seeks progress while union reveals completion. Effort looks for a future arrival point while abiding rests in present reality. The simplicity of this truth is what makes it difficult for the conditioned mind to accept. It wants complexity to justify its own importance. As awareness deepens, there is a growing trust in the invisible activity of life. Silence becomes an active presence rather than an empty pause. Waiting loses its impatience. Doing loses its tension. Life begins to feel lived rather than managed, guided rather than controlled, expressed rather than constructed, and awareness gently remains where effort once struggled to stand. The illusion of separation is subtle and deeply rooted in human perception. It begins with the belief that life is divided into inner and outer, self and other, cause and effect, giver and receiver. From this belief arises the sense that one must defend, improve or compete in order to survive and succeed. Struggle is born not from circumstances themselves, but from this assumption of distance between oneself and the source of life. When separation is assumed, every challenge appears personal. Lack feels threatening, delay feels like denial, and uncertainty feels unsafe. The individual begins to believe that life must be negotiated with, persuaded or conquered. Prayer becomes a request sent outward rather than a listening inward. Work becomes effortful striving rather than inspired participation. Relationships become exchanges of need instead of expressions of shared being. This illusion is convincing because it is reinforced by sensory experience. The eyes see separate forms, the mind names and categorizes, and identity forms around a body and a story. Yet these appearances do not reveal the deeper truth of unity. Beneath all forms is one movement of life expressing itself in countless ways. The wave appears separate from the ocean, but it has never left it. In the same way, the individual appears distinct while never being apart from the source. Struggle arises when one tries to live as an isolated unit in a universe that functions as a whole. The sense of, I must make this happen, creates pressure and fatigue. Fear arises because an isolated self feels fragile. Desire becomes anxious because fulfillment seems external and uncertain. Even spiritual seeking can become another form of struggle when it is driven by the belief that something essential is missing. As awareness shifts, the illusion begins to loosen. One starts to notice that life moves effortlessly in nature. Growth does not argue with timing. Provision appears without anxiety. Harmony is the underlying order, not chaos. When this recognition dawns inwardly, trust begins to replace control. One no longer feels abandoned in a hostile world but supported within an intelligent flow. The dissolving of separation does not remove responsibility, it transforms it. Action is no longer driven by fear of lack or desire for validation. It becomes a response to inner prompting rather than outer pressure. Compassion arises naturally because the boundary between self and other softens. Forgiveness becomes possible because blame loses its foundation. Many continue to struggle because the illusion of separation flatters the ego. It promises autonomy, control and importance. Yet it delivers anxiety and exhaustion. Unity, by contrast, asks for surrender, not loss but release. It does not diminish individuality, it places it in harmony with the whole. When separation fades, life is no longer something to fix. Problems are met with stillness instead of panic. Guidance is felt rather than forced. Peace is not dependent on conditions but rests in understanding. Struggle ends not because circumstances disappear, but because the belief that one stands alone dissolves, and life is recognized as a shared movement rather than a personal burden. Inner stillness is often mistaken for inactivity or withdrawal, yet it is neither absence nor escape. It is a state of receptive awareness in which the mind ceases its habitual commentary and allows deeper intelligence to come forward. Most people live in constant mental noise, interpreting, judging, anticipating, and rehearsing. This noise becomes so familiar that it is assumed to be life itself, yet it is only a surface activity. Beneath it lies a quiet depth that remains untouched by circumstances. Stillness is not created by force. Any attempt to silence the mind through effort only produces resistance. True inner stillness emerges when attention relaxes its grip on thought. When there is no attempt to fix, solve, or improve the present moment, the mind naturally slows. In this slowing, awareness expands. One begins to sense life directly rather than through interpretation. This stillness is a doorway because it removes interference. When water is stirred, it cannot reflect clearly. When it settles, clarity returns. In the same way, when mental agitation subsides, insight becomes available. Guidance that was previously drowned out by urgency begins to surface. Intuition becomes more reliable than analysis because it arises from a deeper level of perception. Inner stillness does not eliminate thought, it restores thought to its proper place. Thinking becomes a tool rather than a master. Ideas arise when needed and fall away when complete. Creativity flows without pressure, solutions appear without exhaustive reasoning. This is not passivity but alignment. Action taken from stillness is precise because it is not clouded by fear or impatience. Many fear stillness because it feels like loss of control. The mind equates movement with safety and silence with vulnerability. Yet it is in stillness that one discovers stability. External circumstances shift constantly, but inner quiet remains unchanged. This stability allows one to respond rather than react. Emotional balance becomes less dependent on outcomes because awareness is anchored within. The doorway of stillness leads to a sense of connection that cannot be manufactured. One feels accompanied rather than isolated. The sense of being guided replaces the pressure of self-direction. This does not mean that life becomes predictable, but it becomes trustworthy. Even uncertainty loses its threat because it is met from a place of calm awareness. Stillness also softens the boundaries of identity. When thought quiets, the rigid sense of me versus life loosens. One begins to experience moments of simple being without labels or roles. In these moments, peace is not something felt but something recognized as always present. This recognition subtly reshapes perception. What once felt overwhelming now feels manageable. What once demanded control now invites cooperation. Few remain in stillness long enough to discover its depth because the world rewards noise and speed. Yet those who return to it again and again find that it becomes a living presence rather than a temporary state. From this presence, life unfolds with less resistance. Direction becomes clearer not through effort, but through listening, and the doorway remains open wherever awareness is willing to rest in quiet attentiveness. Fruitfulness is commonly associated with effort, planning, and visible productivity, yet these are only surface expressions and not the source. True fruitfulness arises from alignment rather than exertion. When one is inwardly connected to the flow of life, results appear naturally, without strain or self-conscious striving. Just as growth in nature is effortless and unannounced, authentic outcomes emerge quietly when inner communion is intact. Many attempt to produce results by pushing themselves mentally or emotionally. This often leads to burnout, frustration, or a sense of constant incompletion. The mind assumes that more effort equals more results, but this assumption overlooks the role of receptivity. A closed system cannot bear fruit, no matter how hard it works. Openness to inner guidance is what allows expression to take form. Inner communion is not an emotional high or a mystical experience to be chased. It is a steady awareness of connection that does not fluctuate with success or failure. From this awareness, action becomes responsive rather than reactive. One does not act to prove worth or secure identity, but to express what is already present within. This shift changes the quality of every action. Work becomes meaningful, creativity becomes fluid, and service becomes joyful rather than sacrificial. Fruit appears when resistance is removed. Resistance may take the form of fear, doubt, comparison, or impatience. These mental habits block the natural movement of life. When they are seen and released, there is a sense of ease that replaces struggle. One begins to trust timing rather than forcing outcomes. What is meant to emerge does so in its proper season. This kind of fruitfulness is often unnoticed at first because it lacks drama. It does not announce itself with urgency or demand recognition. It simply shows up as coherence, right timing, and sustainable growth. Relationships deepen without manipulation. Opportunities align without excessive effort. Even challenges serve a purpose, shaping clarity rather than creating discouragement. The misconception that fruit must be earned keeps many from recognizing this truth. When life is viewed as something to conquer, every result feels temporary and fragile. When life is experienced as something expressing itself through you, results feel stable and appropriate. There is less attachment to outcomes because identity is no longer tied to them. Inner communion also ensures that fruit nourishes rather than drains. Many achieve success only to find themselves empty afterward. True fruit carries vitality because it arises from connection rather than depletion. It strengthens rather than exhausts. The more it is shared, the more naturally it multiplies. This principle operates silently and without exception. When attention rests inwardly, expression becomes outwardly effective. There is no need to measure progress constantly because growth is evident in balance, clarity, and peace. Fruitfulness ceases to be a goal and becomes a byproduct of alignment, and life unfolds in a way that feels coherent rather than forced, sustainable rather than pressured, and meaningful rather than merely productive. Letting go of personal will is often misunderstood as weakness, passivity, or loss of individuality. In truth, it is the release of a false center that was never capable of directing life with wisdom. Personal will is shaped by fear, memory, ambition, and conditioning. It plans based on past experiences and attempts to control future outcomes. While it appears practical, it is limited because it operates from a narrow perspective, seeing fragments rather than the whole. The higher intelligence that governs life does not need to be informed or instructed. It functions with precision beyond human calculation, coordinating events, timing, and relationships in ways the personal mind cannot foresee. When one insists on personal will, there is often tension, urgency, and anxiety. The sense of, I must make this happen, carries an underlying fear of failure or loss. This fear becomes the driving force behind effort. Letting go does not mean abandoning responsibility or refusing to act. It means releasing the belief that personal effort alone is the source of right outcomes. Action still occurs, but it arises from listening rather than pushing. One begins to feel an inner prompting that is calm, clear, and unforced. This prompting does not argue or demand, it simply indicates direction. Following it brings a sense of rightness even when circumstances are uncertain. As personal will relaxes, resistance dissolves. The mind no longer fights reality or attempts to reshape it through pressure. Acceptance takes the place of struggle. In this state, perception widens. One becomes aware of possibilities that were previously overlooked because attention was fixed on a single desired outcome. Flexibility replaces rigidity, and adaptability becomes natural rather than stressful. Many resist letting go because personal will has been mistaken for identity. The fear arises that without control, one will become insignificant or lost. Yet the opposite is true. As the false center dissolves, individuality becomes clearer. Expression becomes more authentic because it is no longer driven by comparison or approval seeking. There is a sense of being used rather than using life. Higher intelligence expresses itself with simplicity. It does not rush, yet it is never late. It does not strain, yet it accomplishes what is necessary. When one aligns with this intelligence, life feels guided rather than managed. Decisions fall into place without excessive deliberation. Even mistakes become teachers rather than sources of shame. Letting go is not a single act but an ongoing willingness. Each moment offers the choice between control and trust. Over time, trust deepens through experience. One sees that when personal will steps aside, solutions appear, support arrives, and clarity emerges. This does not eliminate challenge, but it removes unnecessary suffering. In this alignment, effort transforms into cooperation. Life is no longer something to dominate but something to partner with. There is relief in discovering that one does not have to carry the weight of outcomes alone. As higher intelligence takes precedence, action becomes effective without being exhausting, purposeful without being forceful, and responsive without being fearful, allowing life to express its wisdom through surrendered awareness. Life expresses itself continuously, yet few recognize how directly it seeks expression through human awareness. Most people experience life as something happening around them, rather than something moving through them. This perception creates distance and turns existence into a series of reactions instead of a living flow. When one remains inwardly aligned, this distance dissolves, and expression becomes natural rather than forced. Inner alignment is not a mental agreement with spiritual ideas but a lived awareness of connection. It is a quiet attentiveness that listens before acting and observes before concluding. In this state, one is not attempting to impress life with effort or demand results from it. There is a willingness to be used, shaped and guided by something deeper than personal preference. When alignment is present, life finds clear channels for expression. Creativity arises without strain. Words carry weight without manipulation. Actions feel appropriate to the moment rather than rehearsed or defensive. This is not because the individual has become extraordinary, but because resistance has lessened. Just as light passes easily through clean glass, intelligence moves freely through unobstructed awareness. Misalignment occurs when fear, ambition, or self-protection dominate perception. In those moments, life's movement feels blocked. Confusion increases, timing feels off, and effort multiplies without corresponding results. These are not punishments but signals indicating that attention has shifted away from inner listening toward outer control. Remaining aligned requires honesty rather than perfection. It involves noticing when tension arises and gently returning to stillness instead of pushing forward blindly. This return does not demand withdrawal from action but refinement of attention. One acts from clarity rather than compulsion, from responsiveness rather than habit. As alignment stabilizes, expression becomes consistent. There is less need to explain, defend, or justify oneself. Integrity replaces performance. Even ordinary tasks carry a sense of meaning because they are infused with presence. Relationships benefit from this alignment as well. Listening becomes deeper. Compassion becomes less effortful. Conflict loses intensity because reactions soften. Life expressing itself through aligned awareness often appears simple from the outside. There may be no dramatic signs or visible spirituality. Yet there is a quiet effectiveness in everything that unfolds. Needs are met in appropriate ways. Opportunities arise without being chased. Challenges are met with steadiness rather than panic. Few remain aligned because the world constantly pulls attention outward. Speed, comparison, and noise encourage distraction. Alignment requires repeated returning, not through discipline, but through valuing inner coherence over external approval. Over time, this coherence becomes familiar. The sense of being guided replaces the urge to control. When life is allowed to express itself freely, there is a feeling of participation rather than effort. One no longer feels like the source of wisdom or strength, but the place where it becomes visible. This recognition brings humility without diminishment and confidence without arrogance. Expression becomes service rather than self-display, and living feels less like a struggle to succeed and more like a willingness to let life move clearly through attentive awareness. What few ever discover is not hidden because it is distant, but because it is simple. Abiding is the quiet recognition of union that has always been present beneath effort, fear, and striving. When the illusion of separation dissolves, struggle loses its authority and life is no longer carried as a personal burden. Inner stillness opens the doorway through which clarity, guidance, and peace naturally flow. From this communion, fruit appears without force, shaped by timing rather than tension. As personal will relaxes, higher intelligence reveals itself as the true source of direction, and life begins to move with ease instead of resistance. In inward alignment, existence shifts from management to participation, from control to trust, from striving to expression. What remains is not a perfected individual, but a willing awareness through which life quietly fulfills itself, naturally, purposefully, and without strict